Chicago is a city of shadows and skyscrapers, where the past never stays buried for long. I'm Nick Sorrentos, and this is Chicago Unsolved. Together with my co-host Carrie, we're diving into the city's mysteries, the murders, the hauntings, and strange occurrences that still echo through our streets. Some stories you've heard, others you'll be shocked to discover. This is where Chicago history meets the unexplained. This is Chicago Unsolved.
One Tail at a Time is a Chicago-based animal rescue that works to end pet homelessness by rescuing animals from overcrowded shelters and placing them in loving forever homes. Our pet mutual aid group works to keep animals in homes by providing support and resources to pet owners in need. Not ready to adopt but want to help? One Tail at a Time relies heavily on monetary and in-kind donations to care for the over 200 pets in our program. If you'd like to donate, please visit our website at onetail.org/donate. You can also sign up to become a One Tail at a Time member for as little as $5 per month. Your monthly donation will help support our pets in need of urgent life-saving medical support. Visit onetail.org/donate to learn more.
Hey everybody, this is Nick from DIBS, and I want to thank all of you for helping us grow our podcast. It's really been a lot of fun talking to some of our guests and getting to shine a light on the things that make this city so fantastic. And I'm so excited to tell you about a new part of Chicago history, and that's going to be our show that's starting right now called Chicago Unsolved. You'll still find it right here on this feed. Each episode, we go deep into the city's mysteries, hauntings, unsolved crimes, and strange stories that have helped shape Chicago's darker side, including our guest today, Mr. Chuck Goudie. Chuck Goudie is a fixture in Chicago journalism, serving as ABC7's chief investigative reporter for more than 4 decades. His work has uncovered corruption, exposed organized crime, and helped shape the city's public conversation on accountability. A multiple Emmy and Murrow Award winner, Goudie has become a watchdog at City Hall and beyond. Recognized for holding Chicago's power players accountable, he was inducted into the Silver Circle of the National Academy of Television of Arts and Scientists. His reporting continues to be a vital part of Chicago's news landscape. Now with NBC5, Chuck continues his legendary work here in the city. Today, we're going to be talking about one story that he has followed throughout his career and led to one of the best interviews that has ever happened on Chicago television. But to get us ready for that conversation, and before we bring him on, I would like to turn this over to my new co-host and my very good friend, Miss Carrie Carrick. Carrie?
Welcome to this week's episode of Chicago Unsolved. Today, we will be discussing a case that has captivated the Chicagoland area for over 50 years, the disappearance of the Brach candy heiress, Hellen Brach. Hellen was born in 1911, and in 1950, she married Frank Brach, and the couple settled in Glenview, Illinois, a quiet suburb just outside of Chicago. Frank Brach owned and operated Brach Candies, and if you've ever eaten one of those little Starlight peppermints or Halloween candy corns, then you've heard of the Brach Candy Company. In fact, if you walk through Walmart or Target candy aisles today, you'll still see the Brach Candies. In 1970, Hellen's husband Frank passed away, leaving Hellen the heir to the Brach Candy fortune. Hellen used her fortune to give back. She was a philanthropist and animal lover. If you've ever visited Lincoln Park Zoo here in Chicago, you would have most likely been in the Hellen Brach Primate House, in which her foundation financed and was named after her. She loved all animals, but especially horses. She was last seen February 17th, 1977 at the Mayo Clinic in Minnesota for a routine exam, and rumors swirled that she was killed because she discovered she was being defrauded by her horse trainer and boyfriend, Richard Bailey. Here to help us break down the case is Emmy-winning reporter Chuck Goudie. Thanks, Chuck, so much for being here. Now, you've been a Chicagoland reporter since the 80s. When did you first hear about the case?
Well, you can barely step foot in Chicago without hearing something about the Hellen Brach case. I mean, it's one of the most famous crime mysteries in the city, and when I started in Chicago, it was still an open case, even though I guess technically it still is. But she was, at that point, considered to be potentially alive, and people were still looking for Hellen Brach, the living woman, as opposed to looking for a body. That obviously has changed over the years. I remember doing an initial story on Hellen Brach just on one of the early anniversaries with details about prime suspects and who the players were. Back then, most of them were still alive.
The horse mafia, which I know is a serious thing, but it has a ridiculous sounding name. And I was wondering if you could just explain to us what the connections were to the crime situation here in Chicago.
Well, Hellen Brach was a horse aficionado, albeit one on kind of the sidelines, but she had a lot of money, and so she was able to buy into the horse world. She was an animal lover, and she loved horses, and so she pretty much got herself into hot water because she was able to afford to buy a couple of horses, and that was her entree to people who had ulterior motives, most notably taking her money and swindling her out of money in bad horse deals.
Coincidentally enough, I grew up riding at the stables on Gulf and Harms. So in the 90s. So the Hellen Brach lore was alive and thriving back then. And, we used to take Ouija boards into the tack rooms late at night, 8, 9, 10 years old. And we were almost sure we knew where she was buried. But
Well,
turns out
you're not alone. A lot of people have thought that.
I was just watching a news report. I'm doing research on this case, and that stables that's there on Gulf and Harms has now been torn down.
Right.
And I think there's a small true crime community within Chicago, maybe trying to do some digging there to see if she's there. There's been some rumors of what happened to her, wondering if you would maybe go into some of the theories and rumors surrounding her disappearance.
There are a lot of parallels in these rumors and the community chatter, especially as the internet has grown since the time she disappeared, that parallel Jimmy Hoffa's case. Not that anybody has said that they met the exact same fate, but clearly both Hoffa and Hellen Brach were involved with people who wanted them gone and didn't have any interest in having them found. And so, as with Hoffa, despite all of the searches for his body and some limited searching for Hellen Brach over the years, I think the likelihood of the remains of either of them being found ever is extremely slim. And most in law enforcement have now come to accept that. The people who wanted to get rid of Hellen Brach, primarily because she was about to blow the whistle on this horse mafia, as you refer to it, they did not want her found because you find a body, you have a murder case, and you have a much better chance of tracking it back to who was responsible for it.
Her disappearance and the investigation into her disappearance kind of pulled back a curtain on the shady underworld of the horse industry, where trainers like Richard Bailey and others would sell very quote unquote expensive, fancy horses to these older women. And unbeknownst to these women, these horses were actually worth nothing. And so they were overpaying. And then in parallel, they were insuring these horses for, hundreds of thousands of dollars back in the 80s, back in the 70s. And then they would go on to execute these horses and collect on the insurance money. So they were double dipping. They were getting these women to buy these expensive horses. And then they were also frauding the insurance companies by collecting the insurance money once these horses were killed.
When you're looking into a story like this, especially you're coming to it later, you said you did one of the anniversary shows. I'm fascinated by the idea that you have sort of been around this story your entire career here. It seems like it kind of goes away, and then every once in a while something happens where it comes back. At what point did it be accepted? They're never really going to know.
I mean, it seemed that way from the start for me. If you don't, law enforcement, if you don't find a body and make an arrest in 24 hours, the odds are you're never going to get there. That's not just some TV myth. We kind of thought, when I say we, my producers over the years and I who have worked on this, we never really had a feeling that Hellen Brach was going to turn up, even when the authorities claimed to have found remains in a forest preserve, or the infamous story of a missing head from the medical examiner's office. All of these things that really become anecdotal to the real case, and that is determining who did it. We think we know why, based on all of the prosecutions over the years, and more importantly, what was done with her. So it became clear to me early on that she was never going to be found, and that and very likely the people who did this would get away with it, with the exception of Richard Bailey, who obviously did serve time connected to the Hellen Brach case.
So there were rumors that a gentleman named Joe Plemons admitted to shooting Brock and that the Chicago mob put her in a steel mill in Gary, Indiana. How credible do you think that is? And if that's the case, why do you think that Joe Plemons and other characters, in that story were never brought to justice?
Well, I interviewed Plemons on a few occasions, and his story was as credible as a story in these circumstances can be. He had an ulterior motive. I mean, he was up to his eyeballs with legal problems as well, and his health was not great. So people in those circumstances will, tend to say anything to either save themselves or, in some cases, put themselves in the middle of a hot case for one reason or another. Is it possible that what he had to say was true? It certainly is possible, and I think that the odds are that Hellen Brach's body was disposed of in a similar way to Jimmy Hoffa, without a trace. It was either in a vat of zinc in some plant in the middle of Northwest Indiana. It was dissolved in a vat of acid, or whatever the case may be. As unpleasant as it sounds, it's very likely that that's how she met her final demise, and why nobody will ever find her. The Plemons story and the connection to organized crime certainly is plausible, but the simple answer to the reason that nobody was ever brought to justice based on what he said was because there was nothing else to it other than what he said. And that's not enough to charge somebody, certainly in the federal system, and didn't seem to be the underpinnings for a murder case in Cook County.
What would cause him to come forward and confess that? I'm not familiar with why someone would even offer that information unless he was being investigated for it. What were the circumstances that led to him to even say that?
I mean, as I recall, this is a long time ago, obviously, but as I recall, what he said to me was that he was hoping to clear his conscience. And there are people who do things like that for a variety of reasons. And so if you take him at his word, then you have a resolution to the Hellen Brach case. You don't have a body, obviously, because of the way he claims that it came down. So I don't discount what he had to say, but it's, that and $8 will buy you a latte at Starbucks.
One other thing I wanted to talk about was, I think his name was Jack Matlick.
Right.
And he was the one who reportedly picked up Hellen Brach from O'Hare Airport and drove her back home after her trip to Minnesota. Although there's been no sort of evidence of that, as her car remained at O'Hare Airport. So that was a little bit confusing to me, why he would pick her up if her car was there, and he would be the last person seen with her. So if that's the case, what do you think his involvement in it was?
Well, I've always thought that Matlick was the key player to this, together with the so-called boyfriend Richard Bailey. I mean, between the two of them, both now dead, they have taken to the grave what happened to Hellen Brach. And while they may not have fired the shot or put the rope around her neck or put her in a vat of acid, they were either there or they know who did it, and they know how the whole scheme came together. I'm not sure Jack Matlick was smart enough to do any of these things on his own, but he certainly could have been used by other people in this horse mafia who had an interest in making sure that Hellen Brach never told her story to the authorities and potentially brought them down. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No. I was just going to ask, do you think that her disappearance wasn't treated, I don't want to say with like the same veracity as something else. I know it was a heavy search, but you have an heiress, she's a woman, there's a boyfriend involved. You have the tabloid aspect of it, but it feels like no one really was focused until much later on the Hellen Brach of it all, that it felt like more was the sensationalism that was driving the investigation. Would you say that that's accurate?
I'm not sure that it's that as much as it is just the time difference. If this case had happened in 2025, people would already be locked up. It would have been solved in 24 hours. The technology of crime solutions back then is not nearly what it is today. And I think that is more of what drove it. The authorities just didn't have the capabilities that they do now to solve crimes like this. I think there was a tremendous amount of attention just based on what I've seen in the coverage of it. I mean, these were headline stories, led TV newscasts for weeks, and continued to over the years. I mean, I arrived in 1980 and picked up the ball on some of these things, and for years continued to chase not only Richard Bailey, but also Jack Matlick, and interviewed Matlick in a parking lot in Pennsylvania, where he was very hostile toward me, to the point where you would have to think that he was so concerned about the later years of his life being spent in prison that he really wanted to make sure that I knew he was serious, that he didn't want to talk about this. So to circle back to your original question about Matlick, he clearly knew what happened, had a motivation to steal as much money as he could from Hellen Brach, and was also easily pliable for other people who are on the periphery of this horse mafia, including Bailey, to try to make this happen and to get rid of her.
I think you brought up a really good point about technology and how they don't really know if Hellen Brach ever made it on the plane back to Chicago. And if that happened today, you would know based on airline computer systems and ticketing systems, which did her boarding pass scan? Did the cameras catch her walking out of O'Hare? No one really knows if she was abducted from Chicago or from Minnesota, though it's looking more like from Chicago, because we have Jack Matlick saying, I picked her up from O'Hare. So, I mean, that would make sense to me. And part of me feels like maybe Jack was strong-armed into helping. One of those situations where if you don't help us, then we're also going to kill you.
I mean, Matlick kept repeating to me that I don't know the truth, and that if I did know the truth, I wouldn't know what to do with the truth. And he was adamant and angry, and really unhappy about having a TV camera 3 feet away from his face on that day in Pennsylvania when we found him. And he obviously knew more than what he was ever willing to say, whatever he was willing to say to the authorities. Had it been even 10 years later, much less 50 years later, he wouldn't have had a leg to stand on, because there would have been forensic evidence in the cars. They would have been able to backtrack more of what he did in the house. There are just all sorts of things that individuals would not have been able to get away with today versus back then.
Do you know if there was DNA testing back when she disappeared, or did that come way later?
Yeah, there was nothing available, and that would be the major forensic area that turned to today.
Based on the details that I've heard from this case, there wasn't any blood found at any scene anywhere. There was no, like, when you say disappeared without a trace, that means without a trace. There's nothing to test. There's no DNA evidence to necessarily look at. And you have people saying they're going to be the boyfriend, so they can be at the house. You're going to find evidence of them being there. I was wondering, before we move on to the details of Richard Bailey as the suspect, could you run us through his backstory as you know it?
Sure, but first, on the DNA part of it and the evidence, I mean, there were rooms in her Glenview house that were repainted at the time she disappeared. There was detail work on cars being done, obviously in an effort to eliminate potential evidence. So there were things that could have been collected and would have been today that vanished along with Hellen Brach. Bailey came onto the scene in a fairly innocuous way, when he met Hellen Brach and the two of them struck up a social relationship. Bailey always talked about it as more of a romantic relationship, to the point where he claimed that they were planning to get married, even though Brach's friends disputed that and said that it wasn't true. But regardless of that, they had a very close relationship, and she seemed to trust him until she didn't. And that was the turning point in their relationship, when she realized that he had swindled her, and that she shouldn't have been trusting him in these horse deals. She actually considered Bailey to be kind of her counselor in these horse deals, not realizing that he was actually taking her.
How is both of you can help me with this one, because you guys keep saying you're inflating. I don't understand how you would be able to artificially inflate the price of a horse. It does seem like that would be something that even in the 1970s, the lineages and the way that it's done is very protected. How was that scam perpetrated?
Sure. Yeah. So there was a lot of players involved. They
Right.
would have veterinarians come and vet the horses in what's called a pre-purchase exam. And one of the vets that these gentlemen would use also went to jail for this. And he would say to these owners, yes, he'd confirm the price, and that, yes, this horse is worth it, and he's sound and moving great, going to win competitions. And then on top of the price of the horse, they're also paying for training. So it's, sometimes we joke a lot in the horse industry, like it's not the cost of the horse that's a lot of money. It's the training and, the upkeep and the vet bills and everything. So these women were being swindled by not just one party. It wasn't just Richard Bailey. There was a lot of other people involved telling them, enforcing to them. And unless you've been in the horse industry your whole life, you're going to rely on your trusted trainer, just as I did growing up. When I was younger, I had no idea what was a good horse, a bad horse, until I had to learn all of it myself. So it was a very intricate scheme.
And Hellen Brach seemed to be the perfect target, because she was more interested in the horses as animals than a payday. And so she didn't really care, from my understanding, about what the horse cost, whether it was worth $50,000 or $30,000, and she certainly could afford all of the upkeep. But she was more interested in being involved in the horse world and horses as animals and the care that they were given. And so Bailey took advantage of that and was good at it, and knew that was why she was interested in the horse world, and he made her pay.
And I'll also add to that I think the reason why, everything came unraveled was because a third party came up to Hellen and told her and said to her, I think, you might want to get a third party vet to come out and look at your horses and make sure that they're worth what you paid for them. And at that point, the person that she had hired to come do a full assessment on their horses said to her, these horses are worth nothing. You paid $50,000. It's not even worth $5,000. They're not sound. They're not trained. They're not show horses.
You had the opportunity. I'm not even sure. I guess this gets to how I wanted to ask this. All these years go by. You're touching on the case off and on. You trace Matlick down to a parking lot in Pennsylvania, but Bailey gets out of jail. Or actually, no, he was still in jail when you interviewed him. I'm sorry, he was still in jail when you interviewed him.
Out of jail.
He was out. Okay, I guess the way he was dressed, it just made it look like he was still in. I would like to ask you, though, when you're pretty sure somebody's guilty, you can't obviously let that in. How do you go about setting up an interview like that? What do you do to gain their trust? What's the process of getting somebody in that position to trust you and do the interview?
Well, the Bailey interview actually started right when he went into prison. I started communicating with him and wanted to set up a jailhouse interview. And he kind of danced around it and said he was interested in it, but he actually thought he was going to win appeals, and that he had these legal proceedings underway, and so he kept backing out of our interview process over the years, saying that he didn't want to do anything to jeopardize it. But I kept the line open, and we might go a year or two without communicating with each other, and then I'd get a letter from him. And he always wanted something. You know, he wanted me to run something down for him or contact somebody and pass along a message, which obviously I wouldn't do. I mean, that's not what I do. I was in it only to try to set up an interview with him at some point. And as it came down to it, his release date kept getting closer. And when I realized the jailhouse interview wasn't going to happen, I said, listen, the day you get out of prison in Florida, I want to be there and I want to talk to you and I want to do a TV interview with you. You're going to be in your 90s and this is going to be your last chance to set the record straight as you see it. And he was one of those individuals who thought he could talk his way out of anything, including an interview with me. And it wasn't that he trusted me, but at that point, I think I was the only one to give him a platform to talk about these things. And so he gets out of prison and I fly to Florida with a crew and I meet him and he has nowhere to go. He's living in some religious halfway house and we got a room in a hotel, as they say, and set up for an interview. And he sat there and took every question I had for 3 hours. And that was the last time I saw him. But I wouldn't say he was honest in the interview because I knew what the backstory was, but he certainly said what he wanted to say. And it made for a heck of a story.
How could he think that we would think he would have nothing to do with it if and you tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure he knew about Joe Plemons admitting about shooting her and the mob dumping her. Okay, Richard Bailey, why would they all be doing that? You know, she had no ties to Joe Plemons that we know of or to the mob. You're the degree of separation between her and him. And just like, you know, most criminals, he thinks he's smarter than everybody else. I'm going to sit down with Chuck and I'm going to show him that I'm innocent, which I don't think he was very compelling of that at all. What was your impression as a human being just sitting down with him?
Well, it was sad. I mean, this is literally the guy's final days, months of his life, and he's wasting it talking to me about something that happened a long time ago. And I kept thinking to myself, you know, what is his end game? Why is he bothering to do this? Why don't you just leave town and go check into some,
Right.
resort somewhere with the little money you have and live out your days on the beach? But that's not what Richard Bailey was about. He felt some psychological need to try to clear the deck of all the bad things that had been said about him, even though that was impossible.
Well, especially if he's not going to take accountability for the bad things he did, like confessing to not confess.
Well, that's why I kept wondering, what in the world is going through this guy's head that motivates him to sit there and try to convince me after all these years that he was a victim and that his fiance had been murdered by some, bad people that he didn't know and he had nothing to do with. It was really uncanny. One of the oddest interviews that I've ever done, and I've done a few in my life.
Well, this is also a guy who wrote a novel based on the murder that there's OJ as If I Did It, right? And then there's, which is like a fact, whatever you want to call that thing. But this is, well, it's a romance novel with his defense attorney because he's innocent. I have to ask, in the Chicago journalism scene, at the point when that book comes out, do you guys talk about that sort of weird stuff, like collectively? Like, first of all, why is this published? And second of all, have you read that book? I guess would be a good place to start.
Yeah, I've read that book, and I kind of compare it to the book that the Tylenol killer, James Lewis, also wrote. In the third person, trying to, in some way, convince people that he didn't do those crimes either. And it was an end of a life book that he wrote for a similar reason that Richard Bailey wrote these things and did the interview with me. I can't explain it, but those are the kind of people who keep, me in business, because it's just such weird behavior that it's almost unbelievable.
So Richard Bailey went to jail for fraud. He was never officially charged with Hellen Brach's murder. Was she the only one that he defrauded, or were there other women in the case that they rolled into the same conviction?
I think that the federal prosecutors may have used some other victims at sentencing. I don't think he was charged with anything else with other female victims, but he had done this. This pattern had worked well for him for decades. And when I did the interview with Bailey, I felt a little bit like what many of those women must have felt like at the bar in Palm Beach when he would first hit on them, and he would try to sweet talk them. He was known, I guess, and proud of the fact that he was known as the Golden Tongue. Not in sexual terms, but because he could sweet talk anybody, and did Hellen Brach and did a number of other women who were underappreciated in their lives, and he knew that. He brought them flowers, he bought them dinner, he gave them jewelry, and he knew exactly the buttons to push in order to get what he wanted, which wasn't a physical relationship totally, although there was that. But it was because he wanted to take their money.
Well, before we get out of here, and I want to thank you again for your time today talking about this, because this has been a lot of fun for both of us, which is a weird thing to say about a murder investigation, I guess. But you've been tracking this story for your career throughout the city. I guess all these years later, why do you think this Unsolved Stories in general, but this particular case, still fascinates people?
Well, it's got a lot of layers to it. I mean, it's a famous Chicago name. The Brach Candy Company still exists. You can still buy it and eat it, and a lot of people do at Halloween. The Hellen Brach saga, the fact that she was never found, the case is still technically open, and you have people who have not paid the price for it. There is, in the crime world, the true crime world, these are the kinds of cases that people want to know about. And there's no bigger Chicago crime case than this one that remains out there and will continue to. I mean, we'll continue to do anniversary pieces, despite the fact that Bailey's dead and Jack Matlick's dead. These other people who were involved are dead. Because Hellen Brach deserves it. And she was, by all appearances, a good person who was swindled by a bad guy or a series of people.
Mr. Goudie, thank you so very much for doing this today. It was such an honor.
Fun to talk about it. I agree with you. You shouldn't have fun with things like this, but after all these years, telling these stories keeps it all alive.
To this day, Hellen Brach's fate is officially unsolved. No body has ever been found, and no one's been officially convicted for her murder. Some believe she was silenced because she threatened to expose the horse fraud schemes. Others tie her death to the mob. What's certain is her disappearance shined a light on the corruption in the horse industry. It forced investigations that convicted dozens of horse owners, trainers, and veterinarians for killing animals to collect insurance money. Hellen's name is now forever linked to both a great mystery and a dark chapter in Chicago history. We want to thank Chuck Goudie for joining us, and thank you for listening to Chicago Unsolved. If you enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend and join us next time as we uncover another mystery woven into the fabric of our city.